Did you ever imagine that dying in a sudden accident would throw you straight into the fragile body of an abused heir, only for you to turn his entire toxic world upside down? Subscribe now, like this video, and drop a comment below with your thoughts as we plunge straight into this captivating story. Part 1. The rain hammered relentlessly against the tall glass windows of the private hospital room, a dark downpour mirroring the storm brewing inside. When Julian opened his eyes, the overpowering scent of antiseptic and cheap bleach flooded his senses. His head throbbed with a sharp, agonizing pulse, and his body felt surprisingly frail, far lighter and weaker than the athletic, imposing frame he was accustomed to. Julian Vale was not supposed to be lying in a hospital bed. A ruthless corporate strategist and the heir to a formidable business empire. The last thing he clearly remembered was the blinding glare of oncoming headlights and the terrifying screech of tires against wet pavement. He had been in a terrible car crash. Yet, as he looked down at his pale, slender fingers, confusion gripped him. This was not his body. "Look at him, acting like he's the victim again." A sharp, shrill voice pierced the quiet room. Julian slowly shifted his gaze toward the door. A middle-aged woman dressed in overly flashy designer clothes stood near the foot of the bed, her face contorted in visible disgust. Beside her stood a young man with crocodile tears glistening on his cheeks, putting on a thoroughly dramatic performance. Sitting near the window, ignoring the entire scene while impatiently checking his wristwatch, was a stern-faced middle-aged man. "What on earth are you people babbling about?" Julian's voice came out raspy, weak, and completely unfamiliar. The woman gasped dramatically, clutching her pearl necklace in exaggerated outrage. "How dare you speak to your stepmother in that tone, Silas? You pushed your poor brother down the stairs during the banquet, and now you have the nerve to play the victim." A sharp spike of foreign memories slammed into Julian's mind like a physical blow. Images flooded his consciousness. Cold dark rooms, hidden bruises tucked under long sleeves, endless verbal abuse, and a young man kneeling silently on marble floors while his family hurled insults. He saw a forced marriage to an emotionally distant billionaire, arranged solely to settle corporate debts and secure a massive contract. The body belonged to Silas Reed, the forgotten, abused illegitimate son of the Reed family. Silas had spent his entire life being trodden upon, manipulated, and treated like disposable trash by his greedy stepmother, his fake half-brother Oliver, and his cold, calculating father. Silas Reed. Julian thought, piecing together the chaotic puzzle. "I survived my crash, but somehow my mind ended up in the body of a broken, helpless boy who was pushed down a flight of stairs." "Did you hear me, Silas?" the stepmother snapped, taking a step forward with her hand raised threateningly. "The Vance family is furious. Your husband hasn't even bothered to visit you once since you were admitted. You are an absolute embarrassment to this family." In the past, Silas would have flinched, lowered his head, and quietly apologized for things he never did. But Julian Vale was not Silas. When the stepmother's hand swung toward his face, Julian moved with lightning speed. His slender wrist caught her arm midair with an iron grip. The entire room went dead silent. The young man stopped crying mid-sob, and the father froze, his eyes wide in disbelief. "If you ever raise your hand against me again," Julian said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm, icy whisper that sent shivers down their spines, "I will ensure that every single illegal financial transaction your family has made over the last decade finds its way onto the desk of the federal prosecutor by tomorrow morning." What did you just say?" the stepmother stammered, her face turning pale as she struggled to pull her hand back. Julian released her arm with a flick of his wrist, as if discarding trash. He leaned back against the plush pillows, a cold, predatory smile playing on his lips. "You heard me. You treated Silas like a doormat because he was too gentle to fight back. But whatever was left of that naive boy died on those stairs. You are dealing with someone entirely different now." Oliver, the half-brother, took a cautious step backward, his theatrical tears completely forgotten. "Dad, he's acting crazy." The father stood up, trying to reclaim his authority, but his voice lacked conviction. "Silas, watch your tone. The Vance contract is the only reason you have any value to this family." "The Vance contract?" Julian chuckled softly, a low, dangerous sound. You mean the contract where you pledged my mother's remaining shares as collateral without my consent? Don't worry, father. I will be reviewing those documents personally very soon. Before the family could process his words, the heavy oak door of the hospital room swung open. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped inside, accompanied by a chilling aura of authority. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, his dark eyes sharp and unreadable. It was Alexander Vance, Silas's legally wedded husband. Alexander was a man renowned for his cold ruthlessness in the business world, a billionaire who had remained emotionally frozen ever since losing his first love years ago. He had married Silas purely as a strategic business transaction, barely sparing the young man a second glance during their 6 months of marriage. Alexander paused at the threshold, taking in the strange atmosphere. He glanced at the terrified stepmother, the trembling half-brother, and finally turned his dark gaze toward the bed. Instead of seeing the weak, timid boy who always cowered in his presence, Alexander found himself locking eyes with a man whose gaze was sharp, fearless, and intensely captivating. Julian lounged on the bed like a king on a throne, exuding an effortless power that didn't belong to the fragile boy in the hospital gown. "Am I interrupting something?" Alexander asked coldly, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "Alexander!" The stepmother piped up, attempting to regain her footing. "Look at him. He's completely lost his mind. He just threatened us." Alexander ignored her completely. His intense gaze remained fixed on Julian. He walked slowly toward the bedside, his footsteps slow and deliberate. "You seem quite energetic for someone who was in a coma for 3 days. Surviving murder attempts tends to give a person a fresh perspective on life," Julian replied smoothly, meeting Alexander's piercing gaze without a single hint of hesitation or fear. Alexander raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise passing through his usually stoic expression. The Silas he knew would have stammered, looked at the floor, and apologized for existing. This person before him felt dangerous, sharp, and intensely intriguing. "Murder attempt?" Alexander asked softly, leaning in slightly. "Oh yes," Julian smiled, his eyes glinting with a sharp, vengeful light. "Someone pushed Silas down those stairs to get rid of him. But unfortunately for them, they failed. And now, everyone involved is going to pay." Inside Julian's mind, a soft, trembling, almost breathless voice suddenly echoed. Who are you? And why are you standing up to them for me?" Julian kept his composure, replying silently in his mind to the soul of the real Silas still lingering within. "My name is Julian, and from this moment on, nobody hurts us ever again." Alexander watched the subtle shift in Julian's expression, feeling an unfamiliar spark of fascination igniting deep within his chest. Something fundamental had changed about his quiet husband, and for the first time in his life, Alexander Vance was utterly captivated. End of Part 1. Part 2. Alexander Vance stood motionless by the hospital bed, his dark eyes locking onto Julian with an intensity that could freeze molten steel. In the 6 months since their arranged marriage, Alexander had barely acknowledged his young husband's existence. Silas had always been a ghost in his massive estate, a quiet, timid shadow that vanished into the background whenever Alexander entered a room. But the person lounging against the hospital pillows right now was no ghost. He was a tempest. "You speak of murder attempts so casually," Alexander said, his deep voice carrying a heavy, dangerous resonance. "Do you have proof, or are you simply looking to create a scene to force my hand?" Julian chuckled softly, a smooth, melodious sound that contained not a shred of fear. He picked up an apple from the fruit basket on the bedside table, examining it with casual indifference before taking a crisp bite. "Proof is something you gather after you identify the motive, my dear husband. And in this lovely family, motives are as common as greed." The stepmother, who had been standing stiffly by the door, let out an indignant gasp. "Alexander, listen to him. He is accusing us of a horrific crime to cover up his own clumsiness. He tripped over his own feet on the grand staircase, and now he wants to destroy our family's reputation." "Reputation?" Julian turned his head, his sharp dark eyes piercing right through the woman. "A family built on forged signatures, stolen inheritances, and physical abuse doesn't have a reputation to preserve. It only has a sentence to serve. Oliver stepped forward, tears brimming in his eyes once more in a desperate attempt to play the fragile victim. Brother, how can you say such cruel things? We brought you up after your mother passed away. We loved you. Julian set the apple down with a sharp click against the plastic tray. If your definition of love involves locking a child in a dark attic for missing a dinner, stealing his mother's stock certificates, and forcing him into an unwanted marriage to clear your own debts, then I suggest you buy a dictionary, Oliver. Silence blanketed the room once again. Silas's father looked thoroughly shaken, his face pale as he stared at his son. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined Silas speaking with such articulate, deadly precision. Inside Julian's consciousness, the fragile spirit of the real Silas trembled. Julian, they're going to get angry. Father will cut off my mother's medical trust fund. Julian answered inwardly, his thought voice cool and reassuring. Let them try, Silas. Your father hasn't paid a dime into that fund for 2 years. He's been embezzling it. I read your mind's memories clearly. Sit back and watch how real predators handle little worms like them. Alexander observed the unspoken shifts in Julian's demeanor. He noticed the absolute lack of panic, the calculated posture, and above all, the mesmerizing fire burning in those eyes. Alexander had built a global financial empire by reading people, by breaking competitors down until they surrendered. Yet, looking at Julian right now, Alexander felt an unfamiliar, intoxicating surge of curiosity. All of you leave, Alexander commanded suddenly, his voice quiet but commanding absolute authority. The father blinked, surprised. Mr. Vance, we need to settle the press release regarding the accident. I said, leave, Alexander repeated, his gaze never shifting from Julian. Realizing that provoking the most powerful tycoon in the country was financial suicide, the Reed family quickly gathered their belongings and scurried out of the room like frightened rodents. The heavy oak door clicked shut, leaving only the sound of the rain tapping against the glass. Julian stretched his arms lazily, letting out a small sigh of relief. Much better. The air in here was getting dense with hypocrisy. Alexander walked closer, stopping right beside the bed. He leaned down slightly, placing one hand on the mattress, trapping Julian within his intimidating presence. Who are you? Alexander asked softly, his eyes narrowing. Because you are certainly not the Silas Reed I married 6 months ago. Julian didn't flinch. He leaned upward, reducing the space between their faces, until he could feel the warm, steady rhythm of Alexander's breath. People change when they touch the bottom of a cold abyss, Mr. Vance. Silas Reed was soft, compliant, and desperate for love. He waited for you every night, hoping you would look at him with something other than cold indifference. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. A rare pang of guilt flickered across his heart, though he quickly masked it. Our marriage was a business arrangement. You knew that from the beginning. And Silas accepted that, Julian replied, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. He accepted your coldness, your silence, and the ghost of your dead ex-lover that you worship like a martyr. But I don't accept scrap metal when I deserve gold. I want out. Alexander's eyes darkened instantly. A dangerous spark flickered in his dark pupils. Out? Divorce, Julian said clearly, a smirk playing on his lips. Prepare the papers. You keep your empire, I reclaim my mother's stolen shares from the Reed Corporation, and we part ways amicably. You can go back to mourning your past, and I can go back to living my life. For the first time in 5 years, Alexander felt his pulse quicken with genuine anger, and an undeniable, overwhelming surge of desire. The thought of signing a piece of paper and letting this captivating fiery creature walk out of his life stirred something primal and possessive deep within him. Divorce. Alexander leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly baritone that sent a warm shiver straight down Julian's spine. You think you can wake up from a coma, insult your family, turn my quiet world upside down, and simply walk away? Why not? Julian raised an eyebrow cheekily. Are you telling me you've suddenly grown attached to your disposable husband? I don't like losing what belongs to me, Alexander murmured, his hand moving slowly to lightly grasp Julian's chin, holding his gaze hostage. "And right now, Silas, you belong to the Vance family." Julian's heart gave a sudden, unexpected thud against his ribs. He felt the intense, oppressive heat radiating from Alexander's body, the dark magnetizing power of a man used to ruling everything around him. Fascinating, Julian thought to himself, feeling a thrilling wave of excitement. This one isn't going to be as easy to crush as the Reed family. Before Julian could offer a witty retort, the private phone on the bedside table vibrated aggressively. Julian reached over, breaking Alexander's grip, and picked up the screen. An unknown caller ID flashed. Julian swiped to answer, placing it on speaker. "Speaking." A distorted, electronically altered voice filtered through the speaker, cold and ominous. "You should have stayed asleep, little boy. If you don't sign the share transfer over to your brother by tomorrow, the next stairwell won't leave you with just a few bruises. We will make sure you stay in the ground." The call disconnected instantly with a sharp beep. The atmosphere in the room turned deadly cold. Alexander's eyes narrowed into slits of lethal rage, his aura instantly shifting from composed businessman to dangerous predator. Someone had dared to threaten his husband right in front of him. Julian, however, simply stared at the phone for 2 seconds, then burst into a smooth, genuine laugh. He looked up at Alexander, his eyes dancing with a chilling, electric excitement. "Well, well," Julian purred, a cold, ruthless smile lighting up his pale face. "It seems my dear family is growing impatient. How utterly delightful." Alexander looked down at the fearless man before him, his chest tightening as an irresistible obsession took root deep within his soul. "You're crazy," Alexander murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "No, Alexander," Julian replied, holding his gaze with absolute confidence. "I'm just getting started." End of Part 2. Part 3. The quiet hum of the luxury sedan's engine filled the interior as Alexander's personal driver navigated the rain-slicked city streets. Julian sat in the plush leather passenger seat, casually gazing out the tinted window while spinning an ancient silver ring around his thumb, a habit he had retained from his past life. Beside him, Alexander remained silent, his brooding presence occupying the space like an unexploded bomb. He had personally discharged Julian from the hospital against the doctor's weak protests, taking full control of his husband's safety. Inside Julian's mind, the spirit of Silas was practically hyperventilating. "Julian, we're going back to the Vance estate. Alexander never lets anyone enter his private study, and he barely speaks to me at home. What if he locks us away to keep us quiet?" Julian mentally offered a calm, dry response. "Relax, little ghost. Alexander isn't going to lock us up. Right now, his brain is trying to comprehend how his timid trophy husband suddenly developed a spine of solid titanium. He's fascinated, not malicious." "You're remarkably quiet for someone who received a death threat 2 hours ago." Alexander's deep voice cut through the silence, breaking Julian's internal conversation. Julian tilted his head, turning to face the billionaire with a slight, playful smirk. "Panicking requires energy, Alexander. I prefer to save my energy for effective retaliation. Besides, sending a distorted voice clip is an amateur tactic. Whoever ordered that call is terrified of what I might do next." Alexander studied Julian's face carefully. The sharp curve of his jaw, the steady focus in his dark eyes, everything about him exuded an air of seasoned authority. "You talk as if you've handled corporate extortion before," Alexander noted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where did a boy who spent his life locked in an art room learn to analyze threats like a seasoned strategist?" Julian didn't blink. He leaned closer to Alexander, resting his chin on his palm. "Maybe dying changes a person's skill set. Or maybe, you just never bothered to look closely enough to see what I was truly capable of." Alexander felt his pulse jump. The proximity was intoxicating. The subtle scent of cedar and rain clinging to Julian was pulling him in like a dark magnet. He reached out, his long fingers gently catching a stray lock of Julian's soft hair and tucking it behind his ear. His touch was surprisingly tender, completely contradicting his hardened reputation. "I am looking now," Alexander murmured, his voice dropping into a low, velvet baritone. and I am finding it impossible to look away. Julian's breath hitched slightly at the sudden warmth of Alexander's fingers against his skin. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed in his chest. Dangerous, Julian thought. The real Silas wanted this man's love for years, and now that I'm here, Alexander is starting to fall. Before the tension could escalate, the sedan pulled up to the grand gates of the Vance estate. The sprawling modern mansion stood illuminated against the night sky, a fortress of steel, glass, and dark marble. As they stepped into the vast foyer, the head housekeeper hurried over, bowing respectfully. "Welcome home, Master Alexander, young Master Silas. We have prepared the guest suite as instructed." "Cancel the guest suite," Alexander commanded coldly, taking off his suit jacket and handing it to the servant. "Silas will be staying in the primary suite with me from now on." The housekeeper blinked in absolute shock. Silas had spent the last 6 months sleeping in a secluded wing of the house, per Alexander's original strict orders. Julian raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile spreading across his face. "Oh? Upgrading my accommodations already? Are you sure you can handle sharing a room with someone who insults your ego daily?" Alexander stepped close behind Julian, his chest nearly pressing against Julian's back as he leaned down to whisper near his ear. "Someone tried to kill you today. Until I figure out who is pulling the strings in the Reed family, you don't leave my sight. Consider it high-security protection." "Or consider it an excuse to keep me close," Julian retorted, turning around within the tight space to lock eyes with him. "Take it however you like," Alexander replied, his gaze dropping momentarily to Julian's lips before rising back to his eyes. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, we attend the Reed Corporation annual shareholder gala." Julian's eyes lit up with dangerous delight. "The annual gala? Where your father plans to officially transfer my mother's remaining stock to Oliver." "Exactly," Alexander smiled, a rare, ruthless expression that showed why he ruled the financial market. "And as your legal spouse and primary investor, I hold 30% of their voting proxy. I believe tomorrow night is the perfect time for you to crash a party." Inside Julian's mind, Silas gasped softly. He's actually helping us?" Julian felt a genuine spark of admiration for the man standing in front of him. Alexander wasn't just protective, he was lethal when provoked. "Partnering with me is risky, Alexander," Julian said softly, his tone turning serious for a brief moment. "If I take down the Reed family, it will cause a massive scandal. It might hurt your stock value." Alexander reached out, his hand cupping the back of Julian's neck, pulling him just an inch closer. "Let it burn," Alexander whispered, his dark eyes ablaze with an intense, unwavering focus. "I have more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But there is only one of you." Julian felt a sharp jolt in his chest. The absolute conviction in Alexander's voice was mesmerizing. Without thinking, Julian leaned in slightly, his lips almost brushing Alexander's jawline. "Then let's give them a show they will never forget." Hours later, the master suite was quiet. Alexander was asleep on one side of the massive king bed, his powerful frame relaxed. Julian lay awake, staring at the high ceiling. Suddenly, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A silent notification popped up. It was an encrypted file sent from his anonymous contact, the private investigator he had secretly hired using Silas's hidden mother's bank account. Julian opened the document. Attached was a leaked internal memo from Reed Corporation, along with a medical report dated 3 years ago. Julian's eyes narrowed into slits of ice as he read the text. The medical report wasn't about Silas's recent fall. It was about Julian Vale's car crash, the very crash that had killed his original body. And listed right at the bottom under the primary financial sponsor of the mysterious trucking firm that hit Julian's car, was the name Victor Reed, Silas's father. Julian swallowed hard, a wave of cold realization washing over him. The car crash that killed Julian Vale and the stair fall that nearly killed Silas Reed were planned by the exact same monster. A quiet voice whispered from deep inside his consciousness, Silas's soul trembling in horror. "Julian, my father didn't just abuse me. He killed you too." Julian gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles turning white, a terrifying, beautiful smile forming on his face in the darkness. Beside him, Alexander stirred in his sleep, his arm automatically reaching out across the mattress and pulling Julian firmly against his warm chest, wrapping him in an instinctive, protective embrace. Julian relaxed into the warmth of Alexander's arms, resting his head against the billionaire's chest. "Game on, Victor," Julian whispered into the dark room. "Tomorrow, you lose everything." End of Part 3. Part 4. The crystal chandeliers of the Grand Regency Ballroom threw blinding reflections across the sea of tuxedos and haute couture gowns. The Reed Corporation's annual gala was in full swing, pulsing with quiet arrogance and high society gossip. At the head table sat Victor Reed, looking every bit the triumphant patriarch, flanked by his wife in emerald satin and Oliver, who was practically preening in a bespoke white suit. Victor cleared his throat and tapped his champagne glass with a silver spoon. The room fell into an expectant hush. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed board members," Victor announced, his voice booming through the microphone. "Tonight marks a historic transition for Reed Corporation. With my eldest son, Silas, currently recovering from an unfortunate household accident, he has made the generous decision to relinquish his inherited managerial proxy. Therefore, I am proud to announce that my son, Oliver Reed, will officially assume full directorial authority over our primary logistics holdings." Polite applause rippled through the room. Oliver stood up, bowing with a practiced, modest smile. Suddenly, the grand oak double doors at the back of the hall slammed open with a heavy, echoing thud. The applause died instantly. Every head turned. Walking side by side into the brilliant light were two men who commanded the entire atmosphere of the room. On the left was Alexander Vance, radiating absolute authority in an immaculate obsidian suit. And on his arm, holding his chin high with razor-sharp confidence, was Julian. He was dressed in a tailored midnight blue velvet blazer that accentuated his lean, graceful frame. His eyes were bright, cold, and electric. A collective gasp echoed across the ballroom. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance, Father." Julian's clear, effortless voice resonated through the silence, cutting through the heavy air like a diamond blade. "But I wouldn't want anyone celebrating a lie on my behalf." Victor's face drained of color, turning a mottled gray.
"Silas."
What are you doing here? You should be in bed." "And miss my own funeral arrangement?" Julian chuckled, a smooth, intoxicating sound that drew every eye in the room. He stepped forward, releasing Alexander's arm, though Alexander remained right at his shoulder like an immovable fortress. "You mentioned I relinquished my managerial proxy. That's fascinating, considering I haven't signed a single piece of paper since waking up." Oliver panicked, his delicate facade shattering. "Brother, you're clearly confused from your head injury. Dad was only trying to protect your health." "Protect my health?" Julian raised an eyebrow, a chilling, mocking smile gracing his lips. He casually reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. "Is that why you redirected my mother's estate trust to offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands 3 days before I fell down those stairs?" Whispers exploded through the crowd like wildfire. Board members exchanged alarmed looks. "Nonsense. Security, remove him." Victor roared, his veins bulging against his collar. "He's lost his mind." Before the security guards could take a single step, Alexander stepped into the center light. His oppressive, terrifying aura instantly froze the guards in their tracks. He glared at Victor with a gaze so dark it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the room. "Touch him and I bankrupt your security firm before midnight," Alexander said softly, his voice low, gravelly, and lethal. "My husband is speaking. Everyone in this room will listen." The room went dead silent. Nobody dared to defy Alexander Vance. Inside Julian's mind, Silas was weeping, not from fear, but from an overwhelming surge of long-denied justice. "Julian, they're trembling. My father is actually trembling." Julian answered silently, his internal voice filled with calm, deadly focus. "This is just the appetizer, Silas. Watch the main course." Julian opened the folder, pulling out a thick stack of certified documents. 5 years ago, upon the passing of Evelyn Reed, 60% of Reed Corporation shares were legally tied to her sole heir, me. My father forged temporary guardianship clauses, claiming I was mentally unfit, and placed those shares under his personal control. Here are the forensic signature audits completed this morning by the State Financial Crime Unit. Julian tossed the papers onto the head table right in front of Victor. The crisp sheets scattered across the white tablecloth, landing right in Oliver's champagne glass. Furthermore, Julian continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority, those shell accounts were used to fund illegal logistics routes, the very same logistics company currently under federal investigation for supply chain sabotage. Victor grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles white. You can't prove any of this. You're a nobody. A pathetic, useless boy who couldn't even keep his husband's attention. He has my attention, Alexander's voice cut in, sharp and merciless. He walked up behind Julian, placing a broad, warm hand firmly on the small of Julian's back, pulling him slightly closer. He has my full, undivided attention. And as the primary institutional investor holding 30% of your debt bonds, I am calling an immediate emergency board vote. Victor Reed is removed from his post effective right now. You can't do this to me. Victor screamed, his face turning purple with rage. I am your father. You were a parasite living off a dead woman's legacy and abusing her child, Julian said coldly, stepping right up to Victor's face. Your reign is over. Suddenly, the side doors of the ballroom opened, and 4 plainclothes police detectives walked in, accompanied by federal auditors. Victor Reed, the lead detective announced, holding up a federal warrant. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, grand embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit grievous bodily harm. As the handcuffs clicked around Victor's wrists, Oliver burst into pathetic tears, begging the officers for mercy, while the stepmother fainted dramatically onto the carpet. The crowd watched in absolute shock as the mighty Reed family was dragged out in shame. Julian stood amidst the chaos, his breathing steady, watching the doors close behind them. A massive weight seemed to lift off his shoulders, and deep inside his soul, the soft, lingering presence of the real Silas let out a long, peaceful sigh. Thank you, Julian. Silas whispered, his voice fading into a serene, tranquil quiet. My past is finally free. Julian smiled softly to himself. Rest well, Silas. Suddenly, Julian felt a sharp tug on his hand. He turned to find Alexander pulling him away from the bustling crowd, guiding him down a quiet, dimly lit side hallway lined with classical oil paintings. Alexander pressed Julian gently against the dark wood-paneled wall, trapping him between his strong arms. The adrenaline in the air was thick, heavy, and intoxicating. You were breathtaking back there, Alexander murmured, his dark eyes burning with an intense, raw hunger that made Julian's breath hitch. Lethal, precise, and entirely captivating. Julian leaned back against the wall, a playful, breathless smirk forming on his face. Did you expect anything less from your partner in crime? No, Alexander whispered, leaning down until their foreheads touched. His thumb gently traced the sharp contour of Julian's cheekbone. When you were sleeping in that hospital bed, I thought I was looking at a broken boy. But you are a wildfire, Julian. Julian froze slightly at the sound of the name. His heart slammed violently against his ribs. What did you just call me? Alexander's dark eyes locked onto Julian's with terrifying clarity, filled with an intense, possessive devotion. I read the financial audit report you left on my desk this morning, Alexander murmured against Julian's lips, his voice thick with emotion. The handwriting wasn't Silas's. It belonged to Julian Vale, the corporate strategist who died in a car crash 3 weeks ago. Julian's eyes widened in absolute shock. You know? I don't care what body you inhabit or what miracle brought you back to life, Alexander growled softly, wrapping his arms securely around Julian's waist, pulling him flush against his body. The soul inside this body is the one I fell in love with, and I am never letting you go. Before Julian could process the confession, Alexander captured his lips in a deep, passionate, possessive kiss that consumed all his doubts, leaving him burning in a thrilling, irresistible heat. End of Part 4. Part 5. The quiet warmth of the dim hallway dissolved into an electric current that surged straight through Julian's veins. Alexander's kiss was demanding, deep, and utterly possessive, burning away the cold, lingering shadows of the ballroom disaster. Julian's hands, usually so disciplined and calculated, instinctively tangled into the thick hair at the nape of Alexander's neck, pulling the billionaire closer as he returned the kiss with equal intensity. When Alexander finally pulled back, his dark eyes were dark with unbridled desire, his heavy chest rising and falling in uneven breaths against Julian's chest. His large hand remained anchored firmly at the small of Julian's back, refusing to allow a single millimeter of space between them. "You knew," Julian rasped, his voice smooth yet breathless, his mind still spinning from the revelation. "You knew I wasn't Silas before I even said a word." Alexander let out a low, gravelly chuckle, his thumb gently caressing Julian's flushed cheekbone. Silas was a sweet, timid soul who apologized for the weather. "You walked into my life like a high-voltage storm, insulted my authority, threatened a multi-million-dollar family, and ate my breakfast with the confidence of an emperor. A sudden personality shift after a coma is one thing, but a complete transformation of intellect, instincts, and sharp business logic is another entirely." Julian tilted his head, a dangerous, thrilling smirk returning to his lips. "And that didn't terrify you? Discovering that the man sharing your bed had the mind of a deceased rival corporate strategist." "Terrify me?" Alexander leaned down, his lips brushing against the sensitive curve of Julian's jaw, sending a sudden shiver straight down Julian's spine. "Julian, it was the first time in 5 years my heart actually started beating again. I didn't care if it was magic, destiny, or psychological madness. I only knew that I was completely, irreversibly obsessed with you." The absolute sincerity in Alexander's voice made Julian's heart hammer violently against his ribs. In his past life, Julian Vale had been a solitary figure, respected, feared, but ultimately isolated at the top of the corporate ladder. Nobody had ever looked at his ruthless, sharp mind and embraced it with such fierce, protective devotion. Before Julian could answer, the heavy double doors at the end of the private corridor clicked open. Alexander's lead assistant, wearing an unusually pale expression, hurried toward them, stopping at a respectful distance. "Sir, Mr. Vance, I apologize for the interruption," the assistant stammered, holding out a secure tablet. "The federal police have just completed the preliminary sweep of Victor Reed's private residence following his arrest. They uncovered something urgent. It concerns the crash 3 weeks ago." Julian's eyes narrowed instantly into razor-sharp slits. The atmosphere between Alexander and Julian transformed from intense romance to lethal tactical focus in less than a second. "Speak," Alexander commanded, his hand shifting down to firmly grip Julian's fingers, intertwining them protectively. "The trucking firm that slammed into Mr. Vale's sports car 3 weeks ago. It wasn't an isolated hit arranged purely by Victor Reed," the assistant explained, his voice shaking slightly. "Victor was merely the local operational executor. The offshore funding accounts that paid off the driver originate from an elite international investment syndicate, the Apex Group." Julian felt a cold wave of adrenaline crash over him. The Apex Group. They were a shadow consortium of ultra-wealthy corporate raiders who had been attempting a hostile takeover of Julian Vale's original empire, Vale International, for over 2 years. "So Victor Reed was just a hired gun," Julian said softly, his voice dropping into a chilling, analytical tone. "He pushed Silas down the stairs because Silas accidentally stumbled onto the encrypted transfer logs connecting Reed Corporation to Apex. And when Victor realized you were investigating Vale International's stock vulnerabilities in your previous body," Alexander added, his dark gaze hardening into solid ice, "he coordinated with Apex to eliminate you on the highway the exact same night." "They tried to wipe us both out," Julian murmured, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Instead, they trapped my mind inside the body of the very target they failed to finish off. How poetically tragic for them." Alexander turned to face Julian, his presence radiating an overwhelming, dangerous authority. "Apex Group thinks Julian Vale is 6 feet under, and they believe Silas Reed is a broken pawn in a police holding cell. They have no idea who they are actually dealing with. They think they've won," Julian replied, his eyes blazing with an electric, vengeful light. Which means their guard is completely down. They are holding the global asset auction for Vale International's remaining shares tomorrow night in the city center. Then we buy back your empire, Alexander said without a second of hesitation. Every single share. Julian looked up at Alexander, genuine surprise flickering in his dark eyes. Alexander, that would cost billions in liquid capital. Apex will fight aggressively for control. Alexander reached out, his long fingers tenderly tracing the line of Julian's lower lip before leaning in to press a firm, possessive kiss against it. I told you before, Julian, Alexander whispered against his mouth, his dark eyes shining with an intense, unwavering pledge. I have endless wealth. But there is only one Julian Vale in this universe. Tomorrow, we tear Apex Group apart piece by piece, together. Julian felt an irresistible warmth expanding inside his chest, consuming every lingering doubt he had ever carried. He squeezed Alexander's hand tightly, leaning in to deepen the kiss. Together, Julian promised against his lips. Let's show them what happens when they provoke the wrong men. End of Part 5. Part 6. The high-stakes private auction hall at the Grand Regency Tower felt less like a financial venue and more like a gladiatorial arena draped in silk and velvet. Down on the main floor, dozens of ultra-wealthy executives, hedge fund moguls, and shadowy representatives of the Apex Group sat in plush leather chairs. They were sipping vintage champagne while bidding away the fractured remains of Vale International, Julian's former empire. Up in the private, glass-fronted VIP balcony overlooking the floor, Julian stood near the ledge. He wore a tailored charcoal gray suit, his hair swept back, looking every bit like a ruthless prince who had returned from the underworld. Beside him, Alexander leaned casually against the mahogany railing, swirling a glass of scotch, his presence commanding, dark, and utterly composed. They're currently at 400 million for the primary tech logistics division, Alexander murmured, his deep voice carrying a quiet, dangerous vibration. That's roughly 40% below market value. Julian let out a smooth, icy chuckle, his sharp eyes tracking a tall, arrogant man sitting in the front row below. That man in the second row, Marcus Vance, no relation to you fortunately, is Apex Group's senior liquidator. He's the one who personally signed off on the liquidation order for my personal estate 2 days after my crash. Alexander set his glass down on the marble table with a sharp, heavy click. His dark eyes narrowed into razor blades as he looked down at the liquidator. Then we start by bankrupting him first. The auctioneer's hammer hovered above the wooden block. 450 million going once, going twice. 1 billion. A calm, velvet voice echoed over the balcony speaker system, cutting through the heavy room like a diamond knife. The entire auction floor went dead silent. Heads snapped upward toward the private balcony. Gasped whispers exploded across the room. Bidding increments were usually tens of millions. Jumping straight to 1 billion was an act of pure, unadulterated financial dominance. Marcus Vance stood up abruptly, his face flushed with irritation as he peered up at the shadowed glass. Who is bidding that absurd amount? The automatic glass doors of the VIP suite slid open with a soft hiss. Julian walked slowly out onto the open balcony ledge, resting his hands lightly on the marble balustrade, looking down at the crowd like an absolute sovereign. Alexander stepped up right behind him, his massive broad frame towering over Julian protectively, his arm resting lightly around Julian's waist in an undeniable display of possession and power. Marcus blinked, staring at Julian in utter disbelief. Silas Reed. What is the meaning of this? You're supposed to be. Supposed to be what, Mr. Vance? Julian interrupted, his voice smooth, resonant, and dripping with deadly charm. In a hospital bed? Or perhaps buried 6 feet under like you and Victor Reed planned? Gasps surged through the crowd. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus gritted his teeth, trying to recover his composure. You're an illegitimate heir with no liquid assets. The auction committee cannot accept a fake bid from a disgraced family member. Alexander leaned forward slightly, his cold, terrifying aura instantly suffocating the entire hall. The bid is backed by the Vance Financial Syndicate, Mr. Vance. And my husband's signature carries unlimited credit in this room. If you wish to challenge us, raise your paddle, or sit down and shut your mouth." Marcus's jaw clamped shut, his face turning pale as sweat broke out on his forehead. Nobody in the international market possessed enough capital to outbid Alexander Vance when he was determined to crush a rival. 1 billion, going once, twice. The auctioneer's hand trembled as he brought the gavel down with a loud crack. "Sold to the Vance estate." Julian turned his head slightly, locking eyes with Alexander, a brilliant, dangerous smirk flashing across his face. "That was entirely too easy, Alexander." "We are just getting started, my love," Alexander whispered against his ear, his hand tightening around Julian's waist, pulling him back into the private shadows of the suite as the glass doors closed once more. Inside the private room, Julian leaned back against the heavy wooden desk, folding his arms. "Apex won't accept defeat so easily. Buying back the logistics division gives us control of the data servers, but Marcus still holds the master encryption keys to Vale International's primary offshore treasury." Alexander walked over, trapping Julian against the desk, leaning down until their faces were inches apart. "Then we don't buy the keys. We take them." "And how do you propose we do that?" Julian asked, his voice dropping into an electric, breathless whisper, his fingers instinctively reaching up to gently trace the lapel of Alexander's suit jacket. Alexander reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a sleek metallic drive, placing it gently into Julian's palm. "My private cybersecurity team intercepted Apex Group's internal network 30 minutes ago. The moment Marcus logged into the auction house server to verify his funds, we mirrored his security tokens. Every single dollar Apex stole from your original company is currently being transferred directly back into your mother's trust fund." Julian froze, staring at the drive in his hand, then looked up at Alexander in absolute, breathtaking awe. You drained Apex Group's entire offshore treasury in real time?" "They tried to steal your life, Julian," Alexander murmured, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, possessive devotion that made Julian's heart race uncontrollably. "Taking their money is the bare minimum penalty." A sudden wave of intense heat and emotion crashed over Julian. In his past life, he had spent years fighting every battle completely alone, building walls around his heart to survive a cutthroat world. But looking at Alexander, a man who moved heaven and earth just to hand him his kingdom back, Julian felt those heavy walls crumble into dust. Without saying another word, Julian grabbed Alexander by his tie, pulling the billionaire down into a fierce, deep, passionate kiss. Alexander groaned softly, wrapping his strong arms around Julian's back, lifting him slightly onto the edge of the desk, deepening the kiss until both of them were breathless, consumed by a thrilling, undeniable hunger. "You are incredible," Julian rasped against Alexander's lips, his dark eyes glowing with a mixture of love and dangerous excitement. "I am whatever you need me to be," Alexander whispered, his thumb tenderly caressing Julian's flushed cheek. "Partner, husband, shield, or weapon." Suddenly, the suit door slammed open violently. Marcus Vance stood in the doorway, his eyes wild, holding a silver revolver trained directly at Julian's chest. "You thought you could ruin us, you little bastard. If Apex goes down, you're coming with me." Julian didn't even flinch. He remained seated on the desk, a cold, mocking smile gracing his lips. "You really should check who is standing in front of you, Marcus." Before Marcus could pull the trigger, Alexander moved with terrifying, lightning speed. He stepped in front of Julian, blocking the line of sight completely, his hand snapping out to grab the barrel of the gun, twisting it upward with bone-crushing force. A deafening gunshot rang out, shattering a glass vase on the side table, followed immediately by Marcus's agonizing scream as Alexander disarmed him, slammed him hard onto the marble floor, and pinned him down with a heavy knee on his chest. Security guards rushed in seconds later, swarming the room and securing the screaming liquidator. Alexander stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs, his dark eyes fixed on Marcus with lethal disgust. "Take him away. Ensure the police add attempted murder to his federal indictment." As the guards dragged Marcus out, Alexander turned back to Julian, his eyes immediately softening as he thoroughly scanned Julian's body for any injuries. "Are you hurt?" Julian slid off the desk, walking over to Alexander, wrapping his arms securely around the billionaire's neck, resting his head against Alexander's broad chest. I'm perfect. Because I have you. Alexander wrapped his arms tightly around Julian, resting his chin on Julian's soft hair, letting out a deep, relieved breath. The storm is over, Julian, Alexander whispered softly into the quiet room. Your empire is restored. The monsters are gone. Julian smiled into Alexander's chest, feeling a deep, profound sense of peace settling into his soul for the very first time in 2 lifetimes. No, Alexander, Julian murmured softly, kissing Alexander's jaw. The storm isn't over. It just finally brought me home. End of Part 6. Part 7. 3 weeks after the dramatic collapse of the Apex Group, the autumn sun spilled softly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the top-floor executive suite at Vale Reed Enterprises. The newly merged conglomerate commanded the city skyline, a shining testament to resilience, strategy, and absolute triumph. Julian sat behind the massive obsidian desk, casually reading through the final acquisition reports while sipping black coffee. Across the room, Alexander leaned against the leather sofa, adjusting his cufflinks with a small, contented smile playing on his lips. You're working too hard for a man who just successfully reclaimed 2 global empires in less than a month, Alexander observed, his deep voice wrapping around Julian like warm velvet. Julian looked up from his tablet, his sharp eyes dancing with a playful, dangerous light. Idleness breeds boredom, Alexander. Besides, watching the stock values rise after putting Victor Reed and Marcus Vance behind bars is my idea of entertainment. Alexander stood up slowly, his tall, imposing frame crossing the vast office with deliberate grace. He stopped right beside Julian's chair, leaning down to place a warm, possessive hand on Julian's shoulder. His thumb gently rubbed through the soft fabric of Julian's shirt, sending a familiar, pleasant shiver straight down Julian's spine. The press is outside, Alexander whispered, his dark eyes locking onto Julian's with intense, unyielding affection. They're calling you a financial prodigy, who survived a tragic accident only to conquer the market. They have no idea that the brilliant strategist running this company actually woke up in a stranger's body. Let them keep guessing, Julian chuckled, leaning back into Alexander's touch, turning his face slightly to kiss the palm of Alexander's hand. The truth is far too absurd for ordinary minds anyway. All that matters is that we won. Not quite everything yet, Alexander murmured softly. He reached into his inner suit pocket and pulled out a sleek velvet-lined mahogany box, placing it smoothly on top of Julian's financial documents. Julian raised an eyebrow, a teasing smirk curling his lips. What's this? A victory prize. Open it, Alexander commanded gently, his gaze unwavering. Julian opened the box. Resting inside on black silk was a beautiful, platinum signet ring engraved with an intricate crest, a delicate fusion of the Vale family emblem and the Vance crest. It was breathtaking, elegant, and heavy with unspoken promise. Julian's breath hitched slightly. His sharp, analytical mind, usually capable of calculating complex financial algorithms in seconds, suddenly froze. Alexander. Julian rasped, looking up into those dark, intense eyes. 6 months ago, I entered an arranged business contract with a timid boy I barely knew, Alexander said, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly baritone filled with raw, unfiltered emotion. I was cold, distant, and trapped in my own past. But then you woke up. You tore down my walls, showed me what it truly means to fight, and gave me a reason to love again. I don't want a contract, Julian. I want a lifetime with you. Julian felt a sharp, overwhelming warmth blooming inside his chest, melting away every tiny shred of guard he had ever built. In his past life as Julian Vale, he had conquered corporate boardrooms, built wealth and earned respect, yet he had always been completely, painfully alone. Now, looking at the most powerful man in the city offering him his heart without a single hesitation, Julian knew he had found something far more valuable than any corporate empire. Julian picked up the ring, sliding it onto his thumb where his old silver ring used to sit. It fit perfectly. You realize what you're asking, right? Julian whispered, a radiant, beautiful smile spreading across his face as he stood up, wrapping his arms securely around Alexander's neck. "You're binding yourself to a man who insults your ego, steals your food, and causes a public scandal everywhere he goes." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Alexander growled softly, wrapping his strong arms tightly around Julian's waist, lifting him slightly off his feet before pulling him into a deep, passionate, breathtaking kiss. The kiss was slow, sweet, and filled with a profound, unspoken vow. Julian melted into Alexander's warmth, feeling completely safe, cherished, and anchored for the first time in 2 lifetimes. Suddenly, a quiet, gentle voice echoed softly from deep within Julian's mind, a soft, fleeting whisper from the lingering soul of Silas. "He really loves you, Julian. Thank you for giving this body a beautiful future." Julian smiled into the kiss, answering inwardly with deep peace. "Rest peacefully, Silas. We are both free now." The soft presence of Silas faded away completely, leaving Julian feeling whole, serene, and entirely present in his own life. When Alexander finally pulled back, his thumb tenderly caressed Julian's flushed cheek. "The press conference starts in 10 minutes. Are you ready to show the world who rules this city?" Julian smoothed down his jacket, locking eyes with Alexander, his dark gaze blazing with an electric, unstoppable confidence. "Together, Alexander," Julian purred, resting his hand firmly over Alexander's heart. "Let's give them something to talk about." Hand in hand, their fingers tightly intertwined, Julian and Alexander walked toward the double doors of the executive suite, ready to step out into the brilliant light of their shared future. End of Part 7. Part 8. The flash of 100 camera lenses illuminated the grand press hall of the Vale Reed Tower like a storm of artificial lightning. Journalists, financial analysts, and television crews jostled for position, desperate for a statement from the duo who had single-handedly restructured the country's entire corporate landscape in less than 30 days. Standing at the mahogany podium, Julian adjusted his dark blue silk tie. He radiated an aura of calm, sovereign authority. Beside him, Alexander stood like an impenetrable fortress, his hand resting casually on the small of Julian's back, a subtle yet unmistakable sign of absolute alignment and possessive protection. "Mr. Vale! Over here!" a senior reporter shouted, holding up a microphone. "Rumors suggest that the former executives of Reed Corporation and the Apex Group are facing life sentences for attempted murder and corporate fraud. Is it true that you were the target of both incidents?" Julian leaned forward slightly, a smooth, chillingly beautiful smile playing on his lips. "The state prosecution has all the evidence they need. The men who attempted to manipulate the market and destroy lives in the process underestimated one fundamental rule of business." "And what rule is that?" another reporter pressed eagerly. Julian locked eyes directly with the central camera lens, his dark eyes sparkling with lethal intelligence. "You never engage in a war of attrition with someone who has already survived the absolute worst you can throw at them." A wave of hushed whispers surged through the press corps. Alexander stepped closer to the microphone, his deep, resonant baritone instantly commanding total silence across the vast auditorium. "Vale Reed Enterprises has officially acquired all remaining logistics assets of the Apex Group. Furthermore, effective immediately, 30% of the conglomerate's net annual dividend will be directed into a newly established public foundation dedicated to protecting victims of domestic abuse and corporate exploitation." The hall erupted into a flurry of camera flashes and frantic note-taking. It was a masterstroke, a move that not only permanently dismantled his former abuser's legacy, but transformed their stolen wealth into a shield for others. As the press conference concluded, security personnel flanked the stage, clearing a private passage toward the executive elevator. The heavy metallic doors slid shut, sealing Julian and Alexander into a serene, quiet sanctuary away from the chaotic roar of the world. Julian let out a soft sigh, leaning his back against the mirrored wall of the elevator. He stretched his arms lazily, looking up at Alexander with a playful, mischievous glint in his eye. "A charitable foundation in my mother's honor? You really know how to make an impression, Mr. Vance." Alexander stepped close, trapping Julian against the glass wall, his dark eyes burning with an intense, unyielding warmth. "I promise to give you your kingdom back, Julian. Ensuring that nobody ever suffers the way you and Silas suffered was part of the deal." Julian's breath hitched slightly at the absolute sincerity in Alexander's voice. He reached up, his fingers gently tracing the sharp line of Alexander's jaw, marveling at how a man once renowned for his ice-cold detachment had become his most fierce, devoted protector. "You've given me much more than a kingdom, Alexander," Julian murmured, his voice dropping into a soft, velvety whisper. "You gave me a home." The elevator chimed softly, opening directly into the penthouse residence atop the tower. Warm, golden sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating a breathtaking, panoramic view of the sparkling bay and the bustling city skyline below. Julian walked out onto the private terrace, the crisp autumn wind gently tousling his soft dark hair. The rain that had stalked his arrival into this world had long passed, leaving behind an endless, clear blue sky. Alexander walked up right behind him, wrapping his broad arms around Julian's waist, pulling Julian's back firmly against his broad chest. He rested his chin softly on Julian's shoulder, taking in the grand view together. "What are you thinking about?" Alexander asked softly, pressing a tender kiss against the side of Julian's neck. Julian leaned back into the solid warmth of Alexander's embrace, looking down at his hand, where the custom platinum signet ring gleamed under the sunlight. "I was thinking about how strange destiny is," Julian replied, a serene smile gracing his lips. "They tried to kill a boy in a stairwell, and they tried to crush a man on a wet highway. They thought death would solve their problems. Instead, it brought us together." Alexander tightened his grip around Julian, his thumb softly tracing the ring on Julian's finger. "There was no accident, Julian. Whether in this life or the next, my heart would have searched for yours until it found you. You belong with me." Julian turned around within Alexander's arms, looking up into those fierce, beautiful dark eyes that held his entire world. A low, genuine laugh escaped his lips, bright, free, and completely devoid of any lingering pain. "Then stay with me," Julian whispered, reaching up to wrap his arms around Alexander's neck, pulling the billionaire down into a deep, tender, lingering kiss that tasted of victory, peace, and eternal devotion. For this lifetime and every lifetime after. As the golden sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of amber and rose, the city below continued its endless rhythm. But up on the high terrace, wrapped in each other's arms, the storm had finally ended, leaving behind two souls who had fought through hell, conquered their past, and found their ultimate sanctuary in one another. End of Part 8. What an intense, incredible journey. From surviving betrayal and identity displacement to taking down an entire corrupt empire and finding true love, this story proved that no matter how hard they try to crush you, a real king always reclaims his crown. If you love this emotional, thrilling BL story and want to see more fierce characters, epic revenge, and deep romance, please give this video a big like. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode. Now, I want to hear from you. What was your favorite moment in the story? Did you fall in love with Alexander's fierce devotion, or Julian's unstoppable, cold-blooded brilliant mind? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read and reply to all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and stay tuned for the next breathtaking story.